On the unforgiving edge of the frontier, where law bent for the rich and mercy was only a rumor, a young woman named Ruth ran barefoot through dust, fleeing a forced marriage to a violent outlaw who claimed he had bought her. She was bruised, out of breath, and one wrong turn away from vanishing forever. When he finally caught her in the middle of town, no one stepped in. Not the shopkeeper, not the sheriff, not a single soul willing to risk it. Except one. A Lakota horseman quietly rode forward and placed himself between Ruth and the man who owned half the county. He didn't threaten nor boast. He simply said, "You will not strike her again." Helping her could have sparked a war. Staying silent would have been safer. But he chose her safety over his own. Neither of them knew that this single act of courage would pull them into a fight for dignity, community, and a kind of home neither had ever been given. And by the time it ended, both their worlds would be changed forever. Before we dive and tell us in comments where in the world you are watching from. Heat shimmered above the packed dirt street when the wagon rattled in like trouble that already knew everyone's name. Leaning porches, a sagging saloon sign creaking in the wind. Everything went quieter as Burke Hanlon's rig halted in front of the Red Ace. Bake stood high in the bed, boots braced wide, one hand clamped around the thin arm of the young woman shoved to her knees beside him. Ruth's dress was crumpled and streaked with dirt, bonnet askew, hair stuck to a face of fear and stubborn refusal. "Debt paid," Burke crowed. "My promised bride," just like her daddy agreed. He jerked Ruth upright and hauled her toward the tailboard as if she weighed nothing. The blacksmith straightened from his anvil. Two saloon girls paused in the doorway. The shopkeeper hovered in his entry, eyes flicking from Burke to the sheriff. Sheriff Duggan stood near the hitch rail, hat low, thumb near his gun but not moving closer. "I never agreed," Ruth rasped, voice cracked from dust and days of arguing. "Sheriff, please, you know this isn't right." Bake laughed and yanked her down, boots thudding into the dirt so hard her knees buckled. "Paper says different," he drawled. "Land, cattle, daughter. One package." Ruth twisted and tore free. She bolted up the street, skirts fisted in both hands, heart pounding loud enough to drown the catcalls. Men chuckled. A woman on a porch shifted her baby and turned away. "Best go quiet, girl," Duggan muttered, not loud enough to matter. The town thinned into open country, ruts stretching toward distant hills and the shape of distant teepees. A single Lakota horseman waited there on a pony, long hair bound back, eyes narrowed against the glare. Chaska had seen this kind of scene before, men in coats and ink talking of law while they traded lives. Burke's boots drew closer. His shadow fell over Ruth, his hand rising to backhand her. Chaska nudged his horse forward and slid between them, calm as stepping into a river he'd crossed before. He didn't reach for a weapon. He met Burke's stare and said in English, "You will not strike her again." The street held its breath. Burke's men shifted. Ruth stood frozen, every story she'd heard of savages colliding with the one thing she could see. A stranger choosing, for no gain, to stand between her and a man who called her debt. The cabin had once smelled of bread and lye soap. By the time Ruth turned 18, it mostly smelled of mouse droppings and cheap whiskey. Shingles lifted, fences leaned, and the pasture lay thin and yellow, like the land itself was tired. Her father came home later each week, shoulders bent, eyes already glazed from town. He'd slam the door, rattle the tin plates, toss his hat on the table hard enough to make the lamp jump. When she asked softly, "Did Mrs. Kelly extend the credit?" his fist hit the boards between them. "Store don't feed us for free," he'd growl. "A daughter ought to earn her keep." After nights like that, Ruth waited for his snores before sliding the inside bolt. Not because it could hold him, but because metal on metal was the only bit of control she still owned. She learned to read the way his boots hit the steps, how hard the door swung, whether the bottle was half or empty. The more debt piled up, the quicker his temper lit. Apologies never came. Only muttered curses for bad luck and bankers, as if numbers had fallen from the sky. She slept light, every creak in the dark a warning, every raised voice a signal to make herself small. Burke Hanlon started showing up the winter the last milk cow died. He arrived with sacks of feed, a block of salt, sometimes coffee wrapped in paper, leaning in the doorway like he owned the air. Be ashamed to see a place like this fold, he'd say, eyes drifting over Ruth as she scrubbed or chopped. Pretty girl like you brings a man luck. His gaze moved slow. Ruth kept a table or stove between them, pulse jumping at every accidental brush of his hand. Her father saw only the supplies. He clapped Burke's shoulder, poured whiskey, laughed too loud. One hard rain night Ruth woke to their voices under her loft. Burke's even, her father slurred. Bank's ready to take this place, Burke said. I clear the note. All I ask is the girl. From the loft she heard the rest. Her father asking about Acres, not her. Burke saying, she's part of it anyway, like another fence line. The silence that followed told her the bargain was done. After that, the door locked from the outside when he rode to town, key scraping while he called it keeping you safe. Her boots disappeared. The mare stayed unsaddled. Nobody else'll want a girl from a broke-down place, he said. On the last evening she heard Burke promise, Dawn, I'll take what's mine. When his snores came, she saddled the half-lame mare and rode for town. Burke snapped the paper straight, the sound as sharp as his grin. You in my way, Indian, he barked at Chaska. Sheriff's seen this. Girl's mine by law. The words rolled down the street, giving every man on the boardwalk something official to hide behind while they stayed at anything but Ruth. Sheriff Duggan hovered by the hitch rail, thumb hooked in his belt, eyes fixed on the paper instead of her bruised arm. Sweat tracked along his jaw despite the dry heat. Her daddy did sign, he said, voice thin. Best not stir things worse. The blacksmith murmured, ain't our business, and backed into his doorway like a door shutting on its hinges. Chaska slid from his paint pony in one slow, unhurried motion. His hands hung open at his sides, nowhere near the sheathed knife at his belt. Dust puffed at his moccasins as he stepped fully between Ruth and Burke, a quiet wall of worn buckskin and beadwork. I'm not here to raid, he said, English careful but firm. I am here because I saw a man raise his hand to a woman. Where I come from, that is a shame. Burke spat near his foot. Where you come from don't count, he sneered. Debt's a debt. Her daddy traded her same as a cow. He rattled the paper like it could turn her into ink and numbers. White law says she's mine. Chaska didn't look at the page. In my people's law, he answered, a woman is not a debt. And she did not give her word. His gaze never left Burke's, but Ruth felt those words land in her chest like something she'd never been allowed to believe. She stood just behind his shoulder, lungs burning, fingers knotted so tight in her skirt her nails hurt. She knew exactly what Burke owning her meant. She'd slept with that dread pressed against her ribs for weeks. She knew exactly how far the sheriff would go to stop it, about as far as the hitch rail at his back. This Lakota was different, and it scared her more than the men she already understood. Every fireside story about raids and scalps rose like smoke in her mind. Girl, Duggan called, still not quite looking at her. Best go along. No sense blood you in the street. Judge can sort it later. She almost laughed. No judge had come when fists hit tables and doors. No law had stepped in when her father signed her away. Then Chaska did something no man had done with her life. He shifted his stance so he no longer blocked either road and turned his face toward her, not the men. His dark eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. You choose, he said quietly. You can go with him, if that is what you want. Or you can come under my protection and live with my people by the river. I will speak for your safety there, but I will not take you. The word dropped inside her like a stone in a dry well. She saw her father sliding the bolt on the outside of her door, Burke's hand clamped on her throat in the wagon, every so-called kindness that had ended with a demand. This offer held danger too, but at least it named itself and left one small piece in her hands. Burke saw the flicker in her eyes and lunged, hand shooting for her arm. Enough, he snarled. You're coming with me. Chaska moved first. His fingers wrapped Burke's wrist, firm and unhurried, as if catching a spooked rein. You heard her, he said, voice low but clear. You do not own her. His gaze lifted past Burke to the mounted men, then toward the low hills where a faint thread of smoke marked the Lakota camp. If you try to take her, you answer not only to me, but to my relatives upriver. We remember those who harm our women. We remember those who shelter with us. The words were soft, but every man in earshot felt the weight of riders they could not see. Berg's crew shifted in their saddles, suddenly calculating bullets against years of trouble. Duggan cleared his throat, fear finally forcing him forward. "All right," he said, louder than before. "Until a judge can look proper at that paper, the girl goes with him as guardian. Temporary. Hanlon, you press it now. You'll start more than you can finish." Berg tore his arm free, face blotched red. "This ain't over," he hissed at Ruth. "You're still mine." Ruth didn't answer. Behind her waited a wagon and a life already sold. Ahead lay a man she feared differently and a camp she knew only from warnings. Her feet still carried her toward Chaska's pony. Chaska walked beside the horse as he led her out of town, not ahead, matching her pace in silence, shoulders set in the tired line of someone who had once failed to save a girl and could not bear to watch it happen again. The river country smelled of mud, willow, and wood smoke instead of manure and whiskey. Ruth rode beside Chaska until the last white roof sank behind them and a ring of painted teepees rose from the grass, smoke curling from their tops. Children stopped their games. Dogs circled, sniffing at her mare. Women glanced up from kettles, their faces measured and unreadable. Every curious eye rubbed against the stories she'd heard since childhood. Night raids, scalps, women carried off and never found. Her fingers locked on the saddle horn, shoulders rigid, as if straightness alone could keep her from flying apart. Chaska saw that tension and did not say the word afraid. He simply led her in at a slow walk, answering greetings in Lakota so she heard laughter and teasing instead of war shouts, guiding her to a teepee painted with red handprints and running horses where an older woman stepped out, gray braid heavy down her back, hands brown and ropey from work. He spoke to the woman in low, fluid tones, then turned to Ruth. "My aunt," he said, "Winyang Luta. This lodge is for women. You stay here, not with me." Ruth slid from the saddle, knees hollow, staring at the dark opening that looked like a mouth ready to close over her. "I don't." The protest died halfway out. Winyan's gaze was direct but patient. "You come," she said in careful English, laying one warm palm on Ruth's forearm and then stepping aside again, making it clear she would not drag her anywhere. At the flap, Chaska lifted the hide. Inside, short leather ties dangled. "These are yours," he told Ruth. "They tie from this side. No one comes in unless you say. Not me. Not any man." It was only a strip of hide, yet it hit harder than any oath. At home, every bolt had screamed from the outside. Ruth ducked into the dim, heart pounding, and tied the flap herself. The canvas shivered with the wind, the knot held because she wanted it to. For the first time in years, a door answered to her hands. She did not leave the lodge that first day. Sun spilled through the smoke hole in narrow bands across blankets and packed earth. Winyang set a wooden bowl of stew just inside, spoke a few soft words Ruth could not follow, and walked away without waiting or insisting. Outside, children shrieked in play. Men's voices rose and fell. Each burst of laughter made Ruth's shoulders jump. She kept a borrowed knife under her blanket, listening for footsteps that slowed too close, tracing in her mind how she would slip free and run for the river if things turned. Through a small seam where hide met pole, she once saw Chaska hand a bridle to a boy and rest his palm briefly on the child's head, mouth bent in a tired half-smile. No swagger, no sudden crack of temper, just a man doing hard chores without making himself larger than he needed to be. On the second morning, Winyang eased the flap aside only after clearing her throat and waited until Ruth met her eyes, then held up a pair of soft-soled moccasins. "For you," she said, setting them down and withdrawing again. When Ruth finally pulled them on, she could move without the heavy thump of boots, each quiet step feeling a little less like a warning to the world. Later, Chaska called her name from several paces away, careful not to crowd the doorway. "There's a calm mare," he said when she emerged, heart racing. "She needs a hand that is not rough. Will you help?" He did not reach for her. He offered the lead rope and talked her through each touch, voice low and slow, letting her stop whenever her breath hitched. By dusk, the mare's breathing had deepened under Ruth's hand, and she realized her own had fallen into the same tired, steady rhythm. Word of the woman Burke tried to buy traveled with traders, One afternoon, Mrs. Kelly's wagon creaked into camp. The storekeeper climbed down with flour and a twist of sugar, greeting Ruth with a plain afternoon, as if this were any neighbor's yard. And by the fire she spoke of how Chaska had once sat up all night with a white child sick with fever because her parents begged him, burying the little girl at dawn and never asking a cent near sunset. Riders appeared as small dark cuts along the far ridge, Berk's men, watching. The camp tightened around Ruth without pushing her aside. Men checked rifles. Women drew children near. Fires were banked low. Thunder moved closer. Rain began to drum on the hide. A shout ripped through the storm. A horse had broken loose, bolting toward the riverbank. Ruth heard Chaska's boots pound past and, before old fear could pin her flat, flung aside her blanket, tore free the tie she had knotted, and plunged into the rain, grabbing the trailing rope beside him and helping haul the crazed animal back from the edge, shaking when it was done as she stared at the flap she'd chosen to open. They saw the riders before they heard them, 7 silhouettes cresting the ridge above the river, sun flashing off rifle barrels. The camp went still. Chaska, leaning on a willow stick because his twisted knee hadn't forgiven the storm, watched Berk and his men descend like buzzards who'd finally scented fresh claim. Sheriff Duggan trailed behind them, hat low, reins loose, the posture of a man who wished he belonged to neither side. They stopped at the line where Lakota ground began, hoofprints halting as if the earth itself drew a boundary. Berk lifted new papers and shook them at the wind. "Bank signed off," he crowed. "Girl's my wife by contract. You hand her over, or I'll have the army ride out and burn this whole patch to dust." Chaska didn't answer with steel. He raised his voice toward the lodges, calling for a council at the bend where the river widened and the cottonwoods grew old. Elders emerged first, gray braids, weather-cracked faces, men who had watched treaties made and broken. Behind them came Winyang Luta, a few younger warriors, Mrs. Kelly with her skirts muddied from the walk, and the preacher from town who looked like he'd been praying since dawn. Ruth stood near the back, hands trembling against her skirt. The circle formed slowly, warily, 2 peoples who shared little except the memory of being wronged by men with papers. The eldest Lakota man spoke first, voice deep and careful. "These disputes of white men bring trouble," he said. "Why should we risk our camp?" Eyes shifted to Chaska, measuring whether he sought vengeance or justice. Chaska bowed his head slightly. "Because a woman is not a price," he answered. "Because she has no voice in the paper he waves." Winyang touched Ruth's elbow, a grounding presence, and Mrs. Kelly whispered, "Speak, dear. Tell them yourself." Ruth's throat burned dry, but she stepped forward. Words scraped free, thin but true. She had never agreed. Her father had been drunk, Berk had threatened her, and the sheriff had watched her dragged like a stray cow. The preacher added that no marriage vows had ever been sought. Mrs. Kelly folded her hands and said plainly, "Berk's cheated half this county. I've seen him trap more than one girl behind a contract." Berk exploded. "She's lying. She's been used. Everyone knows girls like her." But the circle didn't shift. Ruth wasn't standing alone now. She was flanked by warriors and settlers who had weighed her fear against Berk's history and found the truth leaning her way. Chaska spoke again, turning the moment like a blade. "If law is used to excuse cruelty, then someday it will excuse cruelty toward you as well. Take the land if you want your debt paid. But the woman stays. You cannot claim both." Berk's face twisted. Humiliation cut deeper than bullets. His hand darted for his gun. Before leather cleared the holster, 3 Lakota warriors and 2 farmers stepped forward, rifles lifted, bodies forming a line of human fence posts between him and Ruth. Sheriff Duggan's voice cracked as he shouted, "That's enough." He pointed at Berk's papers. "Contracts void. Signed under drunken coercion." And he swallowed hard. "There's a warrant out of Red Rock County. Assault and extortion. You fire a shot, Hamlon, and I'll haul you there myself." Silence pressed in. Berk's men eyed the rifles, the river, the odds. Berk spat in the dirt, hatred thick enough to sting the air. This isn't finished. But he reined his horse away, forced to ride off not by miracle or law, but by a community finally refusing to let him decide what a woman was worth. Weeks passed with a kind of slow change that felt more like weathering than healing. Ruth stayed among Chaska's people, choosing the ring of teepees over the empty cabin the bank reclaimed, letting the land that once traded her away fade behind her like an old scar. She worked beside Winyang Luta, grinding corn, stirring stews, learning the soft rise and fall of Lakota words until they no longer sounded like warnings. She tended the mare she once rode in terror, riding her across open grass without feeling eyes on her back. Nights still brought startles, distant gunshots, raised voices drifting from town. But instead of hiding, she stepped outside to the communal fire, where Chaska often sat mending tack. He always left space for her, never reaching, letting her come close or stay apart. One evening, firelight painting their faces gold, Ruth murmured thanks for the shelter he'd offered and confessed she might never feel truly whole again, only no longer owned. Chaska's reply was quiet. She owed him nothing, and her worth had never been his to give, only to defend. Winyang joined them, and together they watched the horses grazing under the vast, forgiving sky that night in peace.